Hello friends, today Maxim and I will tell you about the main and most interesting news from Montenegro. The Minister of Labor of Montenegro emphasized that Montenegro supports integration into the EU and sees no other alternative. The path is unchanged, and in her opinion, Montenegro will join this organization within a few years. She also noted that Montenegro, as a NATO member, plays a stabilizing role in the Balkans. It's not entirely clear what she meant by that. But in principle, of course, Montenegro's accession to NATO was fundamentally a reasonable step because Montenegro was destroyed multiple times throughout the 20th century, and of course, membership in the alliance will help ensure that this does not happen again in the 21st century.
I'll start right away with the main news of our episode. A quarter of the companies founded by Russians are closing down in Montenegro. Since February 2022, more than 500 companies have been opened, and as of today, 600 have already closed. It's not surprising that most of the company closures have occurred in coastal cities such as Bar, Budva, Herceg Novi, and also Tiva. And the capital, Podgorica, was no exception. So, what's the problem? Russians created most of these companies to legally reside in Montenegro and to obtain residence permits. Realizing that the global situation is dragging on and isn't going to end anytime soon, they are packing up their things and returning home, closing their companies along the way. Complications from the government are also making the situation worse.
Montenegro continues its cooperation with European partners aimed at integrating the country into the EU and joining this organization. Let us recall that earlier, EU representatives stated that the Union would be ready for expansion by the year 2030. There are various opinions about exactly when this will happen. There have also been calls from some EU politicians to speed up this process and admit the Western Balkans more quickly. And in Montenegro, politicians in turn state that previously a tentative date for the country's accession to the EU had been set for 2030. They say, we will speed up this process. We are doing such a great job. We will carry out reforms so quickly and join the EU in 2028. I don't know whether they will succeed or not. The entire country is literally covered with these campaign promises. So we have several such promises there. These include raising pensions, increasing salaries, claiming that this has already been done, and promising to raise, in particular, pensions even further. And another campaign promise, which is also kind of the third important one, is joining the EU by 2028. In reality, joining the EU is actually not that difficult because it doesn't depend on Europe. Is on board, it depends solely on Montenegrin politicians, on how quickly they implement their reforms and essentially fulfill what is expected of them. All things considered, I think this could probably be done within a year. If there were more effective managers who know how to get things done. But since we don't see such super effective managers among our politicians, that's why they are announcing a modest plan up to the year 2028. In theory, it's possible. Will it work out in practice? We'll see in 2028. The Prime Minister of Montenegro announced that the European Commission has approved the allocation of 383 million euros to Montenegro. These funds will be directed towards supporting social reforms and infrastructure development, which should ultimately lead to Montenegro joining the EU no later than 2028. Let us recall that this is one of his main promises to finally bring Montenegro into the Union. Of the allocated amount, 110 million euros will be provided as grants, that is free of charge, while the remaining 273 million will be in the form of concessional loan. The funds will be disbursed gradually in several so-called waves, so to speak. The first wave, that is the first tranche of 29 million, is expected to arrive by the end of the current year, 2024. These investments are part of the European plan for the development of infrastructure in the Western Balkans, including Montenegro.
Ban on the use of plastic bags. Stores must offer alternatives to plastic bags, such as biodegradable or reusable bags. The new law is part of Montenegro's environmental strategy aimed at reducing environmental pollution, complying with EU environmental standards, and promoting a more sustainable lifestyle. However, the ban has raised a large number of questions and difficulties among business representatives, especially in retail and among medium-sized businesses. So, what are the problems and concerns of entrepreneurs? With the introduction of the new law, various difficulties have arisen, especially for small businesses which are less prepared for such significant changes. What will this lead to? An increase in packaging costs and problems with the supply of alternative bags. They are not always reliable, and this can affect the availability of such bags, especially in remote rural areas. And most interestingly, customer dissatisfaction is likely to cause the biggest problems, because many shoppers are not willing to pay extra for reusable bags, as they are already used to free plastic ones and don't want to change any.
The International Monetary Fund has confirmed its forecast for Montenegro's economic growth at 3.7%, which, by the way, is much higher than the European average. I don't remember the exact numbers, but on average across Europe, the economic GDP growth is forecast at less than 1%. So in Montenegro, it's several times higher. Partly because Montenegrins are doing a great job, and partly maybe it's just how things turned out. I don't know, but they carried out two reforms. Europe, now this is the first one, and Europe, now this is the second one. Europe is now one of the few years ago. Europe now. Two was carried out literally this October. As part of both reforms, a significant increase in salaries and pensions was planned, and yes, this was implemented. When the population suddenly starts receiving higher salaries and pensions, they start spending more, and increased household spending inevitably leads to GDP growth. So, in fact, that's exactly what's happening right now. According to their estimates, according to the International Monetary Fund, growth is expected not only this year, but will also continue next year and will be significant as well. In other words, the same level of growth is planned for next year, which is 0.7% higher than what was projected in previous forecasts. If we talk about long-term forecasts, the International Monetary Fund already has projections extending all the way to 2029. And now, in 2029, economic growth will decrease slightly, but nevertheless, even over such a long-term period, they expect that in 2029 economic growth will be 3% of GDP. According to the International Monetary Fund, inflation in Montenegro this year will be 4.2%, and next year it will decrease to 3.7%. This is significantly lower than the inflation rate in the previous few years. As you know, not only in Montenegro, but all over the world, it was just crazy. Nevertheless, if we compare it to earlier times, when inflation in the Eurozone was more or less around 2%, if I'm not mistaken, then basically we can say that it still hasn't returned to those lower levels that existed before the pandemic. That's it. And now, although it is indeed much lower, it is still nevertheless significant. According to estimates by the International Monetary Fund, global GDP growth, including the entire world, is projected to be at 3.2% both this year and next year. So, as we can see, Montenegro with 0.5%, you could say, is ahead of the rest of the world. Well, that's just how it is. And again, I'll repeat, the Eurozone is expected to have a much lower GDP growth rate than the global average and than Montenegro. In fact, it's several times lower there. So, compared to the rest of Europe, Montenegro looks very good in this regard. The World Bank predicts that the Europe Now 2 program will have a moderate impact on inflation, but this effect will be less than it was in 2022 when the Europe Now 1 program was implemented. So, what is this program anyway? Under both the Europe Now 1 and Europe Now 2 programs, both minimum and average salaries and pensions are being increased. Under the Europe Now 1 program, the minimum wage almost doubled, and the average wage also increased significantly. I can't say the exact percentage, but it grew by about 1.5 times. This had some effect on inflation, but the impact was much less than the increase itself. In other words, wages went up. If wages went up by 1.5 times, it doesn't mean that prices also rose by 1.5 times. No, there was an increase, but it was much smaller. So in the end, the population benefited greatly. Now, the growth is also significant, but still less than it was back then. That's why the World Bank is also forecasting that inflation will be a bit faster than before, but still lower than during the Europe Now 1 program, because in fact, wages and pensions were not raised as much as they were that time. It is expected that Montenegro's budget deficit will amount to 4.1%. Let me remind you that in Europe, this is actually a pretty good figure. Although, according to European standards, they try to keep the threshold at 3%. Well, in this case, it has been exceeded. According to estimates, again by the World Bank, the national debt will be about 64 to 65% of GDP. Again, let me remind you that in Europe, 60% of GDP is considered the norm, but very few countries actually meet this standard. In fact, if you compare Montenegro's financial stability with other EU countries, that is, the size of the debt relative to GDP vary, few EU countries have as low a debt as Montenegro does. In most of those countries, it is much higher. The World Bank notes that the Europe Now 2 program, which started here in October of this year, could lead to an increase in the budget deficit, although it is still difficult to predict this precisely, because on the one hand the program raises salaries and significantly reduces payroll taxes, which is actually what creates the 180 million deficit. But at the same time, it increases the preferential VAT rate. For example, previously the preferential VAT rate for certain items such as hotel stays was 7%, but now it will be 15%. Excise taxes are also being raised. So it's quite possible that it will all balance out in the end. But for now, they can't say for sure. In other words, as they say, we need to wait and see. So most likely a more detailed forecast will follow, I think, in the first quarter of next year. They also note that in September there was a decrease in inflation by 0.4%, which indicates a decline in inflation in this region, not only in Montenegro, as they say, but in the region as a whole. In addition, the World Bank announced that it will provide Montenegro with a loan of 80 million euros, and they also expect an increase in investments in Montenegro's economy. In their opinion, Montenegro's economic growth is slowing down, and this year as well as next year it will amount to 3.4%. Let me remind you that I just spoke about the assessment from the International Monetary Fund, and now we are talking about the assessment from the World Bank. We can see that the International Monetary Fund stated that growth would be 3.7%. The World Bank says that growth will be 3.4%. So basically, these are all just forecasts. No one knows the exact numbers, but some economists are expecting 3.7%, while others are expecting 3.4%. Most likely, the truth will be somewhere in the middle. They also explain why, unlike the International Monetary Fund, they are giving lower estimates. They noted that the number of tourists in Montenegro has decreased, and that's actually true. This season was quite poor, so accordingly, they say that they believe Montenegro will only be able to achieve 3.4% GDP growth. Again, by European standards, that's actually not so bad.
Preparations for the winter tourist season. The goal of this plan is to strengthen the tourist season in winter, in order to make Montenegro a year-round tourist destination. They plan to develop the infrastructure in the north and at ski resorts, so that even in the absence of snowfall, there will still be interesting leisure activity. But what does it include? Advertising campaigns and attracting tourists from Europe. Well, that doesn't really affect us one way or the other. Work on improving ski resorts and creating comfortable infrastructure. It wasn't specified exactly what they want to improve, but I really hope they'll finally add snow cannons. And in the end, the government called on the private sector to participate more actively in development. So it will be something like local cooperation, with the involvement of local businesses, restaurants and hotels to create a local tourism environment. We'll see how that turns out. But for now, on to the next news.
Maxim just talked about some news that's very important for many of us. As an avid skier, I care a lot about all this, so I want to add something. Every year I go skiing, I can't even remember for how many years now, ever since I learned how to ski. And what do I see? What's actually happening in Montenegro. If we recall, back when Djukanovic was still in power, he's been gone for several years now, he declared that he would make Montenegro the top ski destination in the region, and in principle the plan is quite realistic. We have all the necessary climate conditions, the required landscapes, and so on. They plan the development of a network of resorts and plan specific development at each individual resort. I have to say, not all of these plans, but many of them are being implemented by the government that succeeded Djukanovic. But they are not implementing the most important thing. That is, it's obvious that in order to become a top ski resort, which was exactly the stated goal, the most important thing is to make artificial snow. In other words, install snow cannons. Just install the snow cannons already. This was kind of obvious in previous years too, but before that there were a few winters that were really good and snowy. People were skiing there from mid-December until the end of March. The year before last half, the season was lost. I don't remember exactly when the snow finally came, but half the season was gone. Last year the season was completely lost there. in Kalashin, only one slope was open. They were somehow hauling snow onto it by hand just to create at least some semblance of a season. Just one slope, can you imagine? And even that was only open for maybe 1 or 2 weeks. So in short, you could say that last year there was no season at all. Naturally, everyone in Kalashin is complaining about. The resort director, I can't remember if it was Kalashin 1600 or Kalashin 1450, was literally shouting, just make artificial snow already. How much longer are we going to talk about it? Let's do it. The locals, of course, are also among the main instigators. But again, not everyone, of course. Of course, you have to understand every Montenegrin there owns a couple of apartments to rent out and live solely off the tourist season. No, of course not. Nevertheless, overall, the resort survives thanks to the season. The summer season in Kalashin is rather weak. Mainly, it's a winter resort, the center of the ski resort. And now, for a year and a half, there hasn't been any snow, you see. And before that, yes, there were 2 good years. But before that was the pandemic, when there were a lot of travel restrictions, so there were very few tourists as well. So in the past 5 years, essentially, Kalashin has only had 2 good seasons. It seemed that artificial snow was really needed. The government realized all of this and they said, artificial snow will be available by the end of 2024. And what do we see? It's the end of 2024. And they're still negotiating about how to do it, when to do it. And now, in about a month and a half, the season in Kalashin is supposed to start. And only now do I hear one smart idea from a politician. So basically, what's the whole fuss about? Why are they dragging this out for so long? The fuss is that everyone understands artificial snow is essential, but at the same time, it's a very expensive luxury. It's not even certain that it will pay off at all, because making artificial snow for an entire resort is quite costly. And only now, at the end of 2024, with the start of the season they promised approaching after last season's catastrophe, they had announced that by this year, by the next season, there will be artificial snow. They are still negotiating. And then one politician says, it's not necessary to reduce the full resort. We can just refresh part of the resort for now, cover the main slopes with artificial snow, and the rest we'll do later as the resort develops. Once it grows, we'll take care of the rest then. Now that's a sensible idea. I just want to say, bingo. What took you so long to come up with that? After all, that's exactly what they do at all the other resorts. Look at Iacolino. It's not fully covered with artificial snow. There just some of the main slopes are, and there's no complete artificial snowmaking at Iacolino. Kopaonik, only last year did they spend 11 million euros to achieve full snowmaking coverage. Before that, they also only had partial coverage. And so, in light of this, I have just one question. At these meetings, it wasn't just the government present, and not just officials, most of whom don't ski and don't understand anything about it. There were surely also representatives from the resorts there. Why couldn't anyone suggest this simple solution, 2 years ago? It's so easy to do, just like they did at other resorts. Take Iacolino, for example, look at how they do it. Just take it, copy it, and make the same decision.
Thank you all for watching. We'll try to release videos like this every week, so you have a regular channel from us. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. And leave comments. Did you like it, not like it? What could be added or changed? Bye everyone!